Here now with more on the terror attack, author and behavioral expert Wendy Patrick.
Now, Wendy, good morning. Thanks for being with us today.
Oh, thanks, Raul. Thanks, Shelley.
Once again, we're talking about this. Why is this particular attack significant?
You know, it's a great question because we're talking about another instance of low-tech, soft-target terrorism. In other words, you don't need a background check to buy an SUV or a knife. And yet these are continuing to become some of the most widely reported threat events that we're seeing in the last couple of years. Obviously, we still have mass shootings. That's still always going to be a problem. But the fact that somebody can take a car that was rented legally, a knife that was obtained legally, and create this kind of carnage in a public place leads everybody to the conclusion that surely there's got to be something more we can do in terms of sight hardening. Now, why is that important? First of all, timing is always important. And of course, yesterday was the one-year anniversary of the horrific Brussels airport/subway attacks that we saw last year. There are so many dates to watch out for, and there are so many soft targets of interest. One of the things that Prime Minister May said just very eloquently, both yesterday and today, is that this attack was a seat of liberty, democracy. In other words, the British Parliament that represents just a beacon of freedom for the world. Sites like that are often targeted for obvious reasons. That's one of the reasons you can no longer walk on Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House.
Wendy, there's been so much talk over the past few months, and we heard it as well in our presidential election about terrorists coming from other countries and committing these acts of terror. But this person was born in Britain, British born. So some people have a hard time understanding how someone can be born in that community, the society, and then still be able to do something like this.
Welcome to the age of social media radicalization. You know, this is a day and age where we look at what inspires these kinds of attacks. In other words, we often hear the word lone wolf terrorist. We don't like to use that word because it's glamorizing in one sense, but there's also no such thing as a lone actor, as we often call them. Whether it's assistance, encouragement, or inspiration, it's hard to argue that anybody acts alone. Now, you already heard that ISIS accepted responsibility for that. There's no corroboration for that claim, but one might argue that ISIS inspired that attack, as we know they've inspired others. Now, we also know that 8 people were arrested overnight. What their involvement is hasn't been revealed yet, nor has the name of the, so far, lone actor in this case. All those details will be put together because we're in breaking news mode. We also have to be careful that we vet each news source as they report out, because as you may know, we've already had one person falsely identified as the killer here. So as we watch and wait, investigators behind the scenes are putting together a more complete picture of what we could have seen from this particular ISIS-inspired terrorist and when.
Okay, Wendy, I have one more question, and I hope this makes sense, because I know that a lot of times when they talk about changing the ideology and what even causes someone to be a part of terrorism, you've got to change their mind. You've got to change that. You expect that when maybe they live in an environment all the time that they're like that. So how do you address that in a society where these people? I'm having a hard time understanding how you can be born, you can live around normal people, but then yet make such a decision to do something like this.
Such a great question, Shelley, because you often hear the term self-radicalization. Nobody radicalizes themselves. They're inspired by outside forces. If you looked at the statistics as to how much time each day that many people spend on social media, it would boggle your mind. And it's that type of influence that often is responsible for the radicalization of individuals that live in an otherwise very tolerant community, a democratic society, as London has. So while it may be hard to believe, what we find is it's occurring more and more because of the pervasive influence that one is able to have electronically in a social media atmosphere over the lives of those that may be already vulnerable to being affected. Because you remember, there's a whole, and obviously we don't have time to go into it, but there's a whole personality profile of somebody that's vulnerable to this type of inspiration and radicalization, the kind of group mentality that causes perhaps people like this I almost said shooter, this stabber and the driver of that vehicle from becoming radicalized.
A lot of these people have this in common, where they don't belong, and the internet, social media has made it easier for them to kind of go into one group, and they relate with these people, and they're sucked into this abyss, and that's it. And that's how you can be in a community, and just you become part of that other community that inspires terror. Let's talk about the location and the timing of this attack. You mentioned it's been a year to the date, and it happened right in front of Parliament. So are there messages being sent with the timing and the location of all of these attacks?
Both and, Raul, and you know those are two excellent points. You look at the location again being something as that Theresa May identified. It's a seat of liberty, a beacon of democracy, really the free society of the freedom that Londoners enjoy. Also, you know, you brought up some good points about the driver of the SUV and the stabber in this case. You know, again, it's not about provocation, but predisposition. So you look at somebody that's already predisposed to look for opportunities like this. Remember, ISIS encourages its followers to look for opportunities like this. So the date is significant, the location is significant, and all public buildings, especially in westernized countries that value liberty and democracy and freedom, already are on high alert for these types of attacks. But this is just yet another reminder that we can't always look for a suspect with a gun. We also have to look for suspects that have access to ordinary items that can be easily transformed into deadly weapons.
Wow.
ISIS is taking responsibility. It seems like almost any time anything like this happens,
Yes, it does.
They do. How do we know that if it's really them or
whether they just inspired individual radicalization. That's part of, no doubt, what law enforcement authorities are looking into right now. That's part of the background, the behind-the-scenes investigation that's ongoing in order to determine, you heard in earlier news reports, this individual was identified as a peripheral figure of interest. Well, this just goes to show that perhaps there's no such thing as a radicalized individual on the periphery, that everybody should be a potential suspect.
I mean, those new words, inspired by, whether or not they directly had inspired by, means that they're doing what they want to do in terms of what ISIS is claiming, and because these people are following suit with their actions, right, Wendy?
Well said, Raul, and inspired by doesn't even need to mean that there was any actual communication. That's the tough thing with a lone actor terrorist, is if you don't have people acting in concert, there's no communication to intercept.
Wendy Patrick, okay, thank you for your insight as always. We
Thanks,
appreciate it.
Raul. Thanks, Shelley.